The Northern infantry, indeed, had not fought like troops who own their opponents as the better men. Rather had they displayed an elasticity of spirit unsuspected by their enemies, and the Confederate soldiers, who knew with what fierce courage the attack had been sustained, looked on the Battle of Sharpsburg as the most splendid of their achievements. No small share of the glory fell to Jackson. Since the victory of Cedar Run, his fame, somewhat obscured by Fraser's Farm and Malvern Hill, had increased by leaps and bounds, and the defence of the West Wood was classed with the march to Manassas Junction, the 3 days' battle about Groveton, and the swift seizure of Harper's Ferry. On October 2nd, Lee proposed to the President that the Army of Northern Virginia should be organized in 2 army corps, for the command of which he recommended Longstreet and Jackson. "My opinion," wrote Lee, "of General Jackson has been greatly enhanced during this expedition. He is true, honest, and brave, has a single eye to the good of the service, and spares no exertion to accomplish his object." On October 11th, Jackson received his promotion as Lieutenant General and was appointed to the 2nd Army Corps, consisting at that date of his own division, the Light Division, Ewell's, and D.H. Hill's, together with Colonel Brown's battalion of artillery, a force of 1,017 officers, 25,000 men, and 126 guns. Jackson does not appear to have been unduly elated by his promotion. For 2 days after his appointment, he wrote to his wife that there was no position in the world equal to that of a minister of the gospel, and his letter was principally concerned with the lessons he had learned from the sermon of the previous Sunday. The soldiers of the 2nd Army Corps, however, did not allow him to forget his greatness. In their bivouacs by the clear waters of the Opequon, with abundance of supplies and with ample leisure for recuperation, the troops rapidly regained their strength and spirit. The reaction found vent in the most extravagant gaiety. No circumstance that promised entertainment was permitted to pass without attention, and the jests started at the expense of some unfortunate wight, conspicuous for peculiarity of dress or demeanour, was taken up by 100 voices. None were spared. A trim staff officer was horrified at the irreverent reception of his nicely twisted moustache, as he heard from behind innumerable trees, "Take the mice out of your mouth. Take 'em out. No use to say they ain't there, see their tails hanging out." Another, sporting immense whiskers, was urged to "come out of that bunch of hair. I know you're in there. I see your ears are working." So the soldiers chaffed the dandies, and the camp rang with laughter. Fun and frolic were always in the air, and the fierce fighters of Sharpsburg behaved like schoolboys on a holiday. But when the general rode by, the men remembered the victories they had won, and to whom they owed them, the hardships they had endured, and who had shared them, and the appearance of Little Sorrel was the sure precursor of a scene of the wildest enthusiasm. The horse soon learned what the cheers implied, and directly they began he would break into a gallop, as if to carry his rider as quickly as possible through the embarrassing ordeal. But the soldiers were not to be deterred by their commander's modesty, and whenever he was compelled to pass through the bivouacs, the same tribute was so invariably offered that the sound of a distant cheer, rolling down the lines of the 2nd Army Corps, always evoked the exclamation, "Boys, look out! Here comes old Stonewall or an old hare." "These being the only individuals," writes one of Jackson's soldiers, "who never failed to bring down the whole house." Nothing could express more clearly the loyalty of the soldiers to their general than this quaint estimate of his popularity. The Anglo-Saxon is averse to the unrestrained display of personal affection, and when his natural reluctance is overborne by irrepressible emotion, he attempts to hide it by a jest. So Jackson's veterans laughed at his peculiarities, at his dingy uniform, his battered cap, his respect for clergymen, his punctilious courtesy, and his blushes. They delighted in the phrase when a distant yell was heard, "Here's old Jack or a rabbit." They delighted more in his confusion when he galloped through the shouting camp. "Here he comes," they said. "We'll make him take his hat off." They invented strange fables of which he was the hero. "Stonewall died," ran one of the most popular, "and 2 angels came down from heaven to take him back with them. They went to his tent, He was not there. They went to the hospital. He was not there. They went to the outposts. He was not there. They went to the prayer meeting. He was not there. So they had to return without him. But when they reported that he had disappeared, they found that he had made a flank march and reached heaven before them. Another was to the effect that whereas Moses took 40 years to get the children of Israel through the wilderness, old Jack would have double-quicked them through in 3 days on half rations. But nevertheless, beneath this affectation of hilarity lay a deep and passionate devotion, and 2 incidents which occurred at this time show the extent of this feeling, and at least one reason for its existence. On October 8th, writes Major Heros von Borke, Adjutant General of the Cavalry Division, I was honoured with the pleasing mission of presenting to Stonewall, as a slight token of Stuart's high regard, a new uniform coat which had just arrived from the hands of a Richmond tailor. Starting at once, I reached the simple tent of our great general just in time for dinner. I found him in his old weather-stained coat, from which all the buttons had been clipped by the fair hands of patriotic ladies, and which, from exposure to sun, rain, and powder smoke, and by reason of many rents and patches, was in a very unseemly condition. When I had dispatched more important matters, I produced General Stuart's present in all its magnificence of gilt buttons and sheeny facings and gold lace, and I was heartily amused at the modest confusion with which the hero of many battles regarded the fine uniform, scarcely daring to touch it, and at the quiet way in which at last he folded it up carefully and deposited it in his portmanteau, saying to me, "Give Stuart my best thanks, Major. The coat is much too handsome for me, but I shall take the best care of it, and shall prize it highly as a souvenir. And now let us have some dinner." But I protested emphatically against the summary disposition of the matter of the coat, deeming my mission indeed but half executed, and remarked that Stuart would certainly ask how the coat fitted, and that I should take it as a personal favour if he would put it on. To this, with a smile, he readily assented, and having donned the garment, he escorted me outside the tent to the table where dinner had been served in the open air. The whole of the staff were in a perfect ecstasy at their chief's brilliant appearance, and the old negro servant, who was bearing the roast turkey to the board, stopped in mid-career with a most bewildered expression, and gazed in such wonderment at his master as if he had been transfigured before him. Meanwhile, the rumour of the change ran like electricity through the neighbouring camps. The soldiers came running by hundreds to the spot, desirous of seeing their beloved Stonewall in his new attire, and the first wearing of a new robe by Louis XIV, at whose morning toilette all the world was accustomed to assemble, never created half the excitement at Versailles that was roused in the woods of Virginia by the investment of Jackson in the new regulation uniform. The second incident is less amusing, but was not less appreciated by the rank and file. Riding one morning near Front Royal, accompanied by his staff, Jackson was stopped by a countrywoman, with a chubby child on either side, who inquired anxiously for her son Johnny, serving, she said, in Captain Jackson's company. The general, with the deferential courtesy he never laid aside, introduced himself as her son's commanding officer, but begged for further information as to his regiment. The good dame, however, whose interest in the war centred on one individual, appeared astonished that Captain Jackson did not know her particular Johnny, and repeated her inquiries with such tearful emphasis that the young staff officers began to smile. Unfortunately for themselves, Jackson heard a titter, and turning on them with a scathing rebuke for their want of manners, he sent them off in different directions to discover Johnny, giving them no rest until mother and son were brought together. But if the soldiers loved Jackson for his simplicity and respected him for his honesty, beyond and above was the sense of his strength and power, of his indomitable will, of the inflexibility of his justice, and of the unmeasured resources of his vigorous intellect. It is curious even after the long lapse of years to hear his veterans speak of their commander. Laughter mingles with tears. Each has some droll anecdote to relate, each some instance of thoughtful sympathy or kindly deed. But it is still plain to be seen how they feared his displeasure, how hard they found his discipline, how conscious they were of their own mental inferiority. The mighty phantom of their lost leader still dominates their thoughts, just as in the battles of the Confederacy, his earthly presentment dominated the will of the Second Army Corps. In the campaign which had driven the invaders from Virginia and carried the Confederate colors to within sight of Washington, his men had found their master. They had forgotten how to criticize. His generals had learned to trust him. Success and adulation had not indeed made him more expansive. He was as reticent as ever, and his troops, the foot cavalry as they were now called, were still marched to and fro without knowing why or whither. But men and officers, instead of grumbling when they were roused at untimely hours, or when their marches were prolonged without apparent necessity, obeyed with alacrity, and amused themselves by wondering what new surprise the general was preparing. "Where are you going?" they were asked as they were turned out for an unexpected march. "We don't know, but old Jack does," was the laughing reply. And they had learned something of his methods. They had discovered the value of time, of activity, of mystery, of resolution. They discussed his stratagems, gradually evolving, for they were by no means apparent at the time, the object and aim of his manoeuvres. And the stirring verses, sung round every campfire, show that the soldiers not only grasped his principles of warfare, but that they knew right well to whom their victories were to be attributed. "Come, stack arms, men, pile on the rails, stir up the campfires bright. No matter if the canteen fails, we'll make a roaring night. Here Shenandoah brawls along, their lofty Blue Ridge echoes strong, to swell the brigade's roaring song of Stonewall Jackson's way. We see him now, the old slouched hat cocked o'er his eye askew, the shrewd dry smile, the speech so pat, so calm, so blunt, so true. The blue-light elder knows them well. Says he, 'That's Banks, he's fond of shell, Lord save his soul, we'll give him—' Well, that's Stonewall Jackson's way. Silence, ground arms, kneel all, caps off, old blue light's going to pray, strangle the fool that dares to scoff. Attention, it's his way. Appealing from his native sod, informer pauperis to God, lay bare thine arm, stretch forth thy rod, amen. That's Stonewall's way. He's in the saddle now. Fall in steady, the whole brigade. Hills at the ford, cut off. We'll win his way out, ball and blade. What matter if our shoes are worn? What matter if our feet are torn? Quick step, we're with him before morn. That's Stonewall Jackson's way. The sun's bright lances rout the mists of morning, and, by George, there's Longstreet struggling in the lists, hemmed in an ugly gorge. Pope and his columns whipped before. "Bayonets and grape!" hear Stonewall roar. "Charge, Stuart! Pay off Ashby's score!" That's Stonewall Jackson's way. Ah, maiden, wait and watch and yearn for news of Stonewall's band. Ah, widow, read with eyes that burn the ring upon thy hand. Ah, wife, sow on, pray on, hope on thy life shall not be all forlorn. The foe had better ne'er been born that gets in Stonewall's way. Chapter 20. Fredericksburg, 1862, October. While the Army of Northern Virginia was resting in the valley, McClellan was preparing for a winter campaign. He was unable, however, to keep pace with the impatience of the Northern people. Not only was he determined to postpone all movement until his army was properly equipped, his ranks recruited, his cavalry remounted, and his administrative services reorganized, but the military authorities at Washington were very slow in meeting his demands. Notwithstanding, then, the orders of the President, the remonstrances of Halleck, and the clamour of the press, for more than 5 weeks after the Battle of Sharpsburg, he remained inactive on the Potomac. It may be that in the interests of the army he was perfectly right in resisting the pressure brought to bear upon him. He was certainly the best judge of the temper of his troops, and could estimate more exactly than either Lincoln or Halleck the chances of success if he were to encounter Lee's veterans on their native soil. However this may be, his inaction was not in accordance with the demands of the political situation. The President, immediately the Confederates retired from Maryland, had taken a step which changed the character of the war. Hitherto, the Northerners had fought for the restoration of the Union on the basis of the Constitution, as interpreted by themselves. Now, after 18 months of conflict, the Constitution was deliberately violated. For the clause which forbade all interference with the domestic institutions of the several states, a declaration that slavery should no longer exist within the boundaries of the Republic was substituted, and the armies of the Union were called upon to fight for the freedom of the Negro. In the condition of political parties, this measure was daring. It was not approved by the Democrats, and many of the soldiers were Democrats, or by those, and they were not a few, who believed that compromise was the surest means of restoring peace, or by those, and they were numerous, who thought the dissolution of the Union a smaller evil than the continuance of the war. The opposition was very strong, and there was but one means of reconciling it: vigorous action on the part of the army, the immediate invasion of Virginia, and a decisive victory. Delay would expose the framers of the measure to the imputation of having promised more than they could perform, of wantonly tampering with the Constitution, and of widening the breach between North and South beyond all hope of healing. In consequence, therefore, of McClellan's refusal to move forward, the friction between the federal government and their general-in-chief, which, so long as Lee remained in Maryland, had been allayed, once more asserted its baneful influence, and the aggressive attitude of the Confederates did not serve to make matters smoother. Although the greater part of October was for the Army of Northern Virginia a period of unusual leisure, the troops were not altogether idle. As soon as the stragglers had been brought in, and the ranks of the divisions once more presented a respectable appearance, various enterprises were undertaken. The Second Army Corps was entrusted with the destruction of the Baltimore and Ohio Railway, a duty carried out by Jackson with characteristic thoroughness. The line from Harper's Ferry to Winchester, as well as that from Manassas Junction to Strasburg, were also torn up, and the spoils of the late campaign were sent south to Richmond and Staunton. These preparations for defensive warfare were not, however, so immediately embarrassing to the enemy as the action of the cavalry. Stuart's 3 brigades, after the affair at Butler's Ford, picketed the line of the Potomac from the North Mountain to the Shenandoah, a distance of 40 miles, Hampton's brigade at Hedgesville, Fitzhugh Lee's at Shepherdstown, Munford's at Charlestown, and headquarters near Leetown. On October 8th, General Lee, suspecting that McClellan was meditating some movement, ordered the cavalry to cross the Potomac and reconnoitre. Tarleton scene. Selecting 600 men from each of his brigades, with General Hampton, Colonels W. H. F. Lee and W. E. Jones in command, and accompanied by 4 horse artillery guns, Stuart rendezvoused on the night of the 9th at Darkesville. As the day dawned, he crossed the Potomac at McCoy's Ford, drove in the Federal pickets, and broke up a signal station near Fairview. October 10. Marching due north, he reached Mercersburg at noon, and Chambersburg, 46 miles from Darkesville, at 7 p.m. on October 10th. Chambersburg, although a Federal supply depot of some importance, was without a garrison, and here 275 sick and wounded were paroled, 500 horses requisitioned, the wires cut, and the railroad obstructed, while the machine shops, several trains of loaded cars, and a large quantity of small arms, ammunition, and clothing was destroyed. October. L'Adepsie et la Chelle. At 9 the next morning, the force marched in the direction of Gettysburg, moving round the Federal rear. Then, crossing the mountains, it turned south through Emmitsburg, past the Monocacy near Frederick, and after a march of 90 miles since leaving Chambersburg, reached Hyattstown at daylight on the 12th. October 12. Here, on the road which formed McClellan's line of communication with Washington, a few wagons were captured, and information came to hand that 4,000 or 5,000 Federal troops were near Poolesville, guarding the fords across the Potomac. Moving at a trot through the woods, the column, leaving Poolesville 2 or 3 miles to the left, made for the mouth of the Monocacy. About a mile and a half from that river, an advanced guard of hostile cavalry moving eastward was encountered and driven in. Colonel Lee's men were dismounted, a gun was brought into action, and under cover of this screen, posted on a high crest, the main body made a dash for White's Ford. The point of passage, although guarded by about 100 Federal riflemen, was quickly seized, and Stuart's whole force, together with the captured horses, had completed the crossing before the enemy, advancing in large force from the Monocacy, was in a position to interfere. This brilliantly conducted expedition was as fruitful of results as the ride round McClellan's army in the previous June. The information obtained was most important. Lee, besides being furnished with a sufficiently full report of the Federal dispositions, learned that no part of McClellan's army had been detached to Washington, but that it was being reinforced from that quarter, and that therefore no oversea expedition against Richmond was to be apprehended. Several hundred fine horses from the farms of Pennsylvania furnished excellent remounts for the Confederate troopers. Prominent officials were brought in as hostages for the safety of the Virginia citizens who had been thrown into northern prisons. Only a few scouts were captured by the enemy, and not a man was killed. The distance marched by Stuart from Darkesville to White's Ford was 126 miles, of which the last 80 were covered without a halt. Crossing the Potomac at McCoy's Ford about 6 a.m. on October 10th, he had recrossed it at White's Ford between 1 and 2 p.m. on October 12th. He was thus for 56 hours inside the enemy's lines, and during the greater part of his march within 30 miles of McClellan's headquarters near Harper's Ferry. It is often the case in war that a well-planned and boldly executed enterprise has a far greater effect than could possibly have been anticipated. Neither Lee nor Stuart looked for larger results from this raid than a certain amount of plunder and a good deal of intelligence. But skill and daring were crowned with a more ample reward than the attainment of the immediate object. In the first place, the expedition, although there was little fighting, was most destructive to the Federal cavalry. McClellan had done all in his power to arrest the raiders. Directly the news came in that they had crossed the Potomac, troops were sent in every direction to cut off their retreat. Yet so eminently judicious were Stuart's precautions, so intelligent the Maryland soldiers who acted as his guides, and so rapid his movements, that although constant reports were received by the Federal generals as to the progress and direction of his column, the information came always too late to serve any practical purpose, and his pursuers were never in time to bar his march. General Pleasonton, with such cavalry as could be spared from the picket line, marched 78 miles in 24 hours, and General Averell's brigade quartered on the upper Potomac 200 miles in 4 days. The severity of the marches told heavily on these commands, already worn out by hard work on the outposts, and so many of the horses broke down that a period of repose was absolutely necessary to refit them for the field. Until his cavalry should have recovered, it was impossible for McClellan to invade Virginia. In the second place, neither the Northern government nor the Northern people could forget that this was the second time that McClellan had allowed Stuart to ride at will round the Army of the Potomac. Public confidence in the General-in-Chief was greatly shaken, and a handle was given to his opponents in the ranks of the abolitionists, who, because he was a Democrat and had much influence with the army, were already clamouring for his removal. Oct. 26. The respite which Stuart had gained for Virginia was not, however, of long duration. On October 26th, McClellan, having ascertained by means of a strong reconnaissance in force that the Confederate army was still in the vicinity of Winchester, commenced the passage of the Potomac. The principal point of crossing was near Berlin, and so soon as it became evident that the Federal line of operations lay east of the Blue Ridge, Lee ordered Longstreet to Culpeper Courthouse. Jackson, taking post on the road between Berryville and Charlestown, was to remain in the valley. On November 7th, the situation was as follows. Army of the Potomac. 1st Corps, Warrenton. 2nd Corps, Rectortown. 3rd Corps, between Manassas Junction and Warrenton. 5th Corps, White Plains. 9th Corps, Waterloo. 11th Corps, New Baltimore. Cavalry Division, Rappahannock Station and Sperryville. Line of supply, Orange and Alexandria and Manassas Railways. 12th Corps, Harper's Ferry and Sharpsburg. Army of Northern Virginia. 1st Army Corps, Culpeper Courthouse. 2nd Army Corps, Headquarters, Millwood. Cavalry Division, Hampton's and Fitzhugh Lee's brigades on the Rappahannock. Reserve Artillery, Munford's brigade with Jackson. Lines of supply, Staunton, Strasburg-Staunton, Culpeper Courthouse, Richmond, Gordonsville. November 7th. On this date, the 6th Corps of the Army of the Potomac assembled between the Bull Run Mountains and the Blue Ridge numbered 125,000 officers and men present for duty, together with 320 guns. The Confederates were heavily outnumbered by the force immediately before them. Along the Potomac, from Washington westward, was a second hostile army, not indeed as large as that commanded by McClellan, but larger by several thousands than that commanded by Lee. The northern capital held a garrison of 80,000. At Harper's Ferry were 10,000. In the neighborhood of Sharpsburg, over 4,000. Along the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, 8,000. Thus, the total strength of the Federals exceeded 225,000 men. Yet, in the face of this enormous host, and with Richmond only weakly garrisoned behind him, Lee had actually separated his two wings by an interval of 60 miles. He was evidently playing his old game, dividing his army with a view to a junction on the field of battle. Lincoln, in a letter of advice with which he had favoured McClellan a few days previously, had urged the importance of making Lee's line of supply the first objective of the invading army. An advance east of the Blue Ridge, he said, would at once menace the enemy's line of communications and compel him to keep his forces together, and if Lee, disregarding this menace, were to cut in between the Army of the Potomac and Washington, McClellan would have nothing to do but to attack him in rear. He suggested, moreover, that by hard marching it might be possible for McClellan to reach Richmond first. The Confederate line of communications, so the President believed, ran from Richmond to Culpeper Courthouse, and McClellan's advanced guards on November 7th were within 20 miles of that point. Lee, however, had altogether failed to respond to Mr. Lincoln's strategical pronouncements. Instead of concentrating his forces, he had dispersed them, and instead of fearing for his own communications, he had placed Jackson in a position to interfere very seriously with those of his enemy. Mr. Lincoln's letter to McClellan shows that the lessons of the war had not been altogether lost upon him. Generals Banks and Pope, with some stimulus from Stonewall Jackson, had taught him what an important part is played by lines of supply. He had mastered the strategical truism that an enemy's communications are his weakest point. But there were other considerations which had not come home to him. He had overlooked the possibility that Lee might threaten McClellan's communications before McClellan could threaten his, and he had yet to learn that an army operating in its own country, if proper forethought be exercised, can establish an alternative line of supply and provide itself with a double base, thus gaining a freedom of action of which an invader, bound, unless he has command of the sea, to a single line, is generally deprived. The President appears to have thought that if Lee were cut off from Richmond, the Army of Northern Virginia would be reduced to starvation and become absolutely powerless. It never entered his head that the astute commander of that army had already, in anticipation of the very movement which McClellan was now making, established a second base at Staunton, and that his line of supply, in case of necessity, would not run over the open country between Richmond and Gordonsville, but from Staunton to Culpeper, behind the ramparts of the Blue Ridge. Lee, in fact, accepted with equanimity the possibility of the Federals intervening between himself and Richmond. He had already, in the campaign against Pope, extricated himself from such a situation by a bold stroke against his enemy's communications. And the natural fastness of the valley, amply provided with food and forage, afforded facilities for such a manoeuvre which had been altogether absent before the Second Manassas. Nor was he of Mr. Lincoln's opinion that if the Army of Northern Virginia cut in between Washington and McClellan, it would be a simple operation for the latter to about-face and attack the Confederates in rear. He knew, and Mr. Lincoln, if he had studied Pope's campaign, should have known it too, that the operation of countermarching, if the line of communication has been cut, is not only apt to produce great confusion and great suffering, but has the very worst effect on the moral of the troops. But Lee had that practical experience which Mr. Lincoln lacked, and without which it is but waste of words to dogmatize on strategy. He was well aware that a large army is a cumbersome machine, not readily deflected from the original direction of the line of march. And more than all, he had that intimate acquaintance with the soldier in the ranks, that knowledge of the human factor, without which no military problem, whether of strategy, tactics, or organization, can be satisfactorily solved. McClellan's task, therefore, so long as he had to depend for his supplies on a single line of railway, was not quite so simple as Mr. Lincoln imagined. Nevertheless, on November 7th, Lee decided to unite his army. As soon as the enemy advanced from Warrenton, Jackson was to ascend the valley and, crossing the Blue Ridge at Fisher's Gap, join hands with Longstreet, who would retire from Madison Courthouse to the vicinity of Gordonsville. The Confederates would then be concentrated on McClellan's right flank should he march on Richmond, ready to take advantage of any opportunity for attack, or, if attack were considered too hazardous, to threaten his communications and compel him to fall back to the Potomac. The proposed concentration, however, was not immediately carried out. In the first place, the Federal advance came to a sudden standstill, and in the second place, Jackson was unwilling to abandon his post of vantage behind the Blue Ridge. It need hardly be said that the policy of manoeuvring instead of entrenching, of aiming at the enemy's flank and rear instead of barring his advance directly, was in full agreement with his views of war, and it appears that about this date he had submitted proposals for a movement against the Federal communications. It would be interesting indeed to have the details of his design, but Jackson's letter book for this period has unfortunately disappeared, nor did he communicate his ideas to any of his staff. Letters from General Lee, however, indicate that the manoeuvre proposed was of the same character as that which brought Pope in such hot haste from the Rappahannock to Bull Run, and that it was Jackson's suggestion which caused the Commander-in-Chief to reconsider his determination of uniting his army. "As long as General Jackson," wrote Lee to the Secretary of War on November 10th, "can operate with safety and secure his retirement west of the Massanutten Mountains, I think it advantageous that he should be in a position to threaten the enemy's flank and rear, and thus prevent his advance southward on the east side of the Blue Ridge. General Jackson has been directed accordingly, and should the enemy descend into the valley, General Longstreet will attack his rear and cut off his communications. The enemy apparently is so strong in numbers that I think it preferable to baffle his designs by manoeuvring, rather than resist his advance by main force. To accomplish the latter without too great a risk and loss would require more than double our present numbers." His letter to Jackson, dated November 9th, ran as follows. "The enemy seems to be massing his troops along the Manassas Railroad in the vicinity of Piedmont, which gives him great facilities for bringing up supplies from Alexandria. It has occurred to me that his object may be to seize upon Strasburg with his main force, to intercept your ascent of the valley. This would oblige you to cross into the Lost River Valley, or west of it, unless you could force a passage through the Blue Ridge. Hence my anxiety for your safety. If you can prevent such a movement of the enemy, and operate strongly on his flank and rear through the gaps of the Blue Ridge, you would certainly, in my opinion, effect the object you propose. A demonstration of crossing into Maryland would serve the same purpose, and might call him back to the Potomac. As my object is to retard and baffle his designs, if it can be accomplished by manoeuvring your cause as you propose, it will serve my purpose as well as if effected in any other way. With this understanding, you can use your discretion, which I know I can rely upon, in remaining or advancing up the valley. Keep me advised of your movements and intentions, and you must keep always in view the probability of an attack upon Richmond from either north or south, when a concentration of force will become necessary." Jackson's plan, however, was not destined to be tried. McClellan had issued orders for the concentration of his army at Warrenton. His troops had never been in better condition. They were in good spirits, well supplied and admirably equipped. Owing to the activity of his cavalry, coupled with the fact that the Confederate horses were at this time attacked by a disease which affected both tongue and hoof, his information was more accurate than usual. He knew that Longstreet was at Culpeper and Jackson in the valley. He saw the possibility of separating the two wings of the enemy's forces, and of either defeating Longstreet or forcing him to fall back to Gordonsville, and he had determined to make the attempt. On the night of November 7th, however, at the very moment when his army was concentrating for an advance against Longstreet, McClellan was ordered to hand over his command to General Burnside. Lincoln had yielded to the insistence of McClellan's political opponents, to the rancour of Stanton and the jealousy of Halleck. But in sacrificing the general who had saved the Union at Sharpsburg, he sacrificed the lives of many thousands of his soldiers. A darker day than even the Second Manassas was in store for the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was not a general of the first order, but he was the only officer in the United States who had experience of handling large masses of troops, and he was improving every day. Stuart had taught him the use of cavalry, and Lee the value of the initiative. He was by no means deficient in resolution, as his march with an army of recently defeated men against Lee in Maryland conclusively proves, and although he had never won a decisive victory, he possessed, to a degree which was never attained by any of his successors, the confidence and affection of his troops. But deplorable as was the weakness which sanctioned his removal on the eve of a decisive manoeuvre, the blunder which put Burnside in his place was even more so. The latter appears to have been the protégé of a small political faction. He had many good qualities. He was a firm friend, modest, generous, and energetic. But he was so far from being distinguished for military ability that in the Army of the Potomac it was very strongly questioned whether he was fit to command an army corps. His conduct at Sharpsburg, where he had been entrusted with the attack on the Confederate right, had been the subject of the severest criticism, and by not a few of his colleagues he was considered directly responsible for the want of combination which had marred McClellan's plan of attack. More than once Mr. Lincoln infringed his own famous aphorism, "Never swap horses when crossing a stream." But when he transferred the destinies of the Army of the Potomac from McClellan to Burnside, he did more. He selected the weakest of his team of generals to bear the burden. At the same time that McClellan was superseded, General Fitzjohn Porter, the gallant soldier of Gaines's Mill and Malvern Hill, probably the best officer in the Army of the Potomac, was ordered to resign command of the Fifth Army Corps and to appear before a court-martial on charges of incompetency and neglect of duty at the Second Manassas. The fact that those charges were preferred by Pope, and that Porter had been allowed to retain his command through the campaign in Maryland, were hardly calculated to inspire the army with confidence in either the wisdom or the justice of its rulers. And it was the general opinion that his intimate friendship with McClellan had more to say to his trial than his alleged incompetency. Burnside commenced his career by renouncing the enterprise which McClellan had contemplated. Longstreet was left unmolested at Culpeper, and, in order to free the communications from Jackson, the Federal army was marched eastward along the Rappahannock to Falmouth, a new line of supply being established between that village and Aquia Creek, the port on the Potomac, 6 hours' sail from Washington. Lee had already foreseen that Jackson's presence in the valley might induce the Federals to change their line of operations. Fredericksburg, on the south side of the Rappahannock, and the terminus of the Richmond and Potomac Railroad, had consequently been garrisoned by an infantry regiment and a battery, while 3 regiments of cavalry patrolled the river. This force, however, was not posted on the Rappahannock with a view of retarding the enemy's advance, but merely for observation. Lee, at this date, had no intention of concentrating at Fredericksburg. The Federals, if they acted with resolution, could readily forestall him, and the line of the North Anna, a small but difficult stream 36 miles south, offered peculiar advantages to the defence. November 17. The Federal march was rapid. On November 15th, the Army of the Potomac left Warrenton, and the advanced guard reached Falmouth on the afternoon of the 17th. General Sumner, in command, observing the weakness of the Confederate garrison, requested permission from Burnside to cross the Rappahannock and establish himself on the further bank. Although 2 army corps were at hand and the remainder were rapidly closing up, Burnside refused, for the bridges had been broken, and he was unwilling to expose part of his forces on the right bank with no means of retreat except a difficult and uncertain ford. The same day, part of Longstreet's corps and a brigade of cavalry were sent to Fredericksburg, and on the 19th, Lee, finding that the Federals had left Warrenton, ordered Longstreet to concentrate his whole force at Fredericksburg, and summoned Jackson from the valley to Orange Courthouse. Jackson, meanwhile, had moved to Winchester, probably with the design of threatening the enemy's garrisons on the Potomac, and this unexpected movement had caused much perturbation in the north. Pennsylvania and Maryland expected nothing less than instant invasion. The merchant feared for his strongbox, the farmer for his herds. Plate was once more packed up. Railway presidents demanded further protection for their lines. Generals begged for reinforcements, and, according to the Times correspondent, it was the universal belief that Stonewall Jackson was ready to pounce upon Washington from the Shenandoah, and to capture president, secretaries, and all. But before apprehension increased to panic, before Mr. Lincoln had become infected by the prevailing uneasiness, the departure of the Confederates from the valley brought relief to the affrighted citizens. On November 22nd, Jackson bade farewell to Winchester. His headquarters were not more than 100 yards from Dr. Graham's manse, and he spent his last evening with his old friends. He was in fine health and fine spirits, wrote the minister's wife to Mrs. Jackson. The children begged to be permitted to sit up to see General Jackson, and he really seemed overjoyed to see them, played with them and fondled them, and they were equally pleased. I have no doubt it was a great recreation to him. He seemed to be living over last winter again, and talked a great deal about the hope of getting back to spend this winter with us in the old room, which I told him I was keeping for you and him. He certainly has had adulation enough to spoil him, but it seems not to affect or harm him at all. He is the same humble, dependent Christian, desiring to give God all the glory, looking to him alone for a blessing, and not thinking of himself. So it was with no presage that this was the last time he would look upon the scenes he loved, that Jackson moved southward by the Valley Turnpike. Past Kernstown his columns swept, past Middletown and Strasburg, and all the well-remembered fields of former triumphs, until the peaks of the Massanuttons threw their shadows across the highway, and the mighty bulk of the noble mountains, draped in the gold and crimson of the autumn, once more re-echoed to the tramp of his swift-footed veterans. Turning east at Newmarket, he struck upwards by the familiar road, and then, descending the narrow pass, he forded the Shenandoah, and crossing the Luray Valley vanished in the forests of the Blue Ridge. Through the dark pines of Fisher's Gap he led his soldiers down to the Virginia plains, and the rivers and the mountains knew him no more until their dead returned to them. On the 26th, the 2nd Army Corps was at Madison Courthouse. 9:27. The next day it was concentrated at Orange Courthouse, 36 miles from Fredericksburg. In 8 days, 2 being given to rest, the troops had marched 120 miles, and with scarce a straggler, for the stern measures which had been taken to put discipline on a firmer basis, and to make the regimental officers do their duty, had already produced a salutary effect. On Jackson's arrival at Orange Courthouse, he found the situation unchanged. Burnside, notwithstanding that heavy snowstorms and sharp frosts betokened the approach of winter, the season of impassable roads and swollen rivers, was still encamped near Falmouth. The difficulty of establishing a new base of supplies at Aquia Creek, and some delay on the part of the Washington authorities in furnishing him with a pontoon train, had kept him idle, but he had not relinquished his design of marching upon Richmond. His quiescence, however, together with the wishes of the President, had induced General Lee to change his plans. The Army of Northern Virginia, 78,500 strong, although, in order to induce the Federals to attack, it was not yet closely concentrated, was ready to oppose in full force the passage of the Rappahannock, and all thought of retiring to the North Anna had been abandoned. November 29. On November 29th, therefore, Jackson was ordered forward, and while the First Army Corps occupied a strong position in rear of Fredericksburg, with an advanced detachment in the town, the Second was told off to protect the lower reaches of the Rappahannock. Ewell's division, still commanded by Early, was posted at Skinker's Neck, 12 miles southeast of Fredericksburg, a spot which afforded many facilities for crossing. D.H. Hill's at Port Royal, already menaced by Federal gunboats, 6 miles further downstream. A.P. Hill's and Taliaferro's, Jackson's own, at Yerby's House and Guinea's Station, 5 and 9 miles respectively from Longstreet's right, and Stuart, whose division was now increased to 4 brigades, watched both front and flanks. The Rappahannock was undoubtedly a formidable obstacle. Navigable for small vessels as far as Fredericksburg, the head of the tidewater, it is 200 yards wide in the neighbourhood of the city, and it increases in width and depth as it flows seaward. But above Falmouth there are several easy fords. The river banks, except near Fredericksburg, are clad with forest, hiding the movements of troops, and from Falmouth downward the left bank, under the name of the Stafford Heights, so completely commands the right that it was manifestly impossible for the Confederates to prevent the enemy, furnished with a far superior artillery, from making good the passage of the stream. A mile west of Fredericksburg, however, extending from Beck's Island to the heights beyond the Massaponax Creek, runs a long, low ridge, broken by ravines and partially covered with timber, which with some slight aid from axe and spade could be rendered an exceedingly strong position. Longstreet, who occupied this ridge, had been ordered to entrench himself. Gun pits had been dug on the bare crest, named Mary's Hill, which immediately faces Fredericksburg. A few shelter trenches had been thrown up, natural defences improved, and some slight breastworks and abatis constructed along the outskirts of the woods. These works were at extreme range from the Stafford Heights, and the field of fire, extending as far as the river, a distance varying from 1,500 to 3,000 yards, needed no clearing. Over such ground a frontal attack, even if made by superior numbers, had little chance of success. But notwithstanding its manifest advantages, the position found no favour in the eyes of Jackson. It could be easily turned by the fords above Falmouth, Banks, United States, Ely's, and Germanna. This, however, was a minor disqualification compared with the restrictions in the way of offensive action. If the enemy should cross at Fredericksburg, both his flanks would be protected by the river, while his numerous batteries, arrayed on the Stafford Heights and commanding the length and the breadth of the battlefield, would make counterstroke difficult and pursuit impossible. To await attack, moreover, was to allow the enemy to choose his own time and place, and to surrender the advantages of the initiative. Burnside's communications were protected by the Rappahannock, and it was thus impracticable to manoeuvre against his most vulnerable point, to inflict on him a surprise, to compel him to change front, and, in case he were defeated, to cut him off from his base and deprive him of his supplies. The line of the North Anna, in Jackson's opinion, promised far greater results. The Federals, advancing from Fredericksburg, would expose their right flank and their communications for a distance of 36 miles, and if they were compelled to retreat, the destruction of their whole army was within the bounds of possibility. "I am opposed," he said to General D.H. Hill, "to fighting on the Rappahannock. We will whip the enemy, but gain no fruits of victory. I have advised the line of the North Anna, but have been overruled." So the days passed on. The country was white with snow, the temperature was near zero, and the troops, their blankets as threadbare as their uniforms, without great coats, and in many instances without boots, shivered beneath the rude shelters of their forest bivouacs. Fortunately, there was plenty of work. Roads were cut through the woods, and existing tracks improved. The river banks were incessantly patrolled. Fortifications were constructed at Port Royal and Skinker's Neck, and the movements of the Federals, demonstrating now here and now there, kept the whole army on the alert. Nor were Jackson's men deprived of all excitement. He had the satisfaction of reporting to General Lee that D.H. Hill, with the aid of Stuart's horse artillery, had frustrated 2 attempts of the Federal gunboats to pass up the river at Port Royal, and that the vigilance of Early at Skinker's Neck had caused the enemy to abandon the design which he had apparently conceived of crossing at that point. Diashunsh 11. But more vigorous operations were not long postponed. On December 10th, General Burnside, urged by the impatience of the northern press, determined to advance, and the next morning at 3 a.m. the signal guns of the Confederates gave notice that the enemy was in motion. 140 Federal guns, many of large calibre, placed in epaulements on the Stafford Heights, frowned down upon Fredericksburg, and before the sun rose the Federal bridge builders were at work on the opposite shore. The little city, which had been deserted by the inhabitants, was held by Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade of McLaws' division, about 1,600 strong, and the conduct of this advanced detachment must have done much to inspirit the troops who watched their prowess from the ridge in rear. A heavy fog hung upon the water, and not until the bridge was 2/3 completed, and shadowy figures became visible in the mist, did the Mississippians open fire. At such close quarters the effect was immediate, and the builders fled. Twice, at intervals of half an hour, they ventured again upon the deserted bridge, and twice were they driven back. Strong detachments were now moved forward by the Federals to cover the working parties, and artillery began to play upon the town. The Southerners, however, securely posted in rifle pits and cellars, were not to be dislodged, and at 10 o'clock Burnside ordered the heavy batteries into action. Every gun which could be brought to bear on Fredericksburg discharged 50 rounds of shot and shell. To this bombardment, which lasted upwards of an hour, Longstreet's artillery could make no reply. Yet though the effect on the buildings was appalling, and flames broke out in many places, the defenders not only suffered little loss, but at the very height of the cannonade repelled another attempt to complete the bridge. After a delay of several hours, General Hooker, commanding the advance, called for volunteers to cross the river in boats. 4 regiments came forward. The pontoons were manned, and though many lives were lost during the transit, the gallant Federals pushed quickly across. Others followed, and Barksdale, who had no orders to hold the place against superior strength, withdrew his men from the river bank. About 4:30 p.m., 3 bridges being at last established, the enemy pushed forward, and the Mississippians, retiring in good order, evacuated Fredericksburg. A mile below, near the mouth of Hazel Run, the Confederate outposts had been driven in, and 3 more bridges had been thrown across. Thus, on the night of the 11th, the Federals, who were now organized in 3 grand divisions, each of 2 army corps, had established their advanced guards on the right bank of the Rappahannock, and, under cover of the batteries on the Stafford Heights, could rapidly and safely pass over their great host of 120,000 men. Burnside had framed his plan of attack on the assumption that Lee's army was dispersed along the Rappahannock. His balloon had reported large Confederate bivouacs below Skinker's Neck, and he appears to have believed that Lee, alarmed by his demonstrations near Port Royal, had posted half his army in that neighbourhood. Utterly unsuspicious that a trap had been laid for him, he had resolved to take advantage of this apparently vicious distribution, and, crossing rapidly at Fredericksburg, to defeat the Confederate left before the right could lend support. Port Royal is but 18 miles from Fredericksburg, and in prompt action, therefore, lay his only hope of success. Burnside, however, after the successful establishment of his 6 bridges, evinced the same want of resolution which had won him so unenviable a reputation at Sharpsburg. The long hours of darkness slipped peacefully away. No unusual sound broke the silence of the night, and all was still along the Rappahannock. Chapter 12. It was not till the next morning, December 12th, that the army began to cross, and the movement, made difficult by a dense fog, was by no means energetic. 4 of the 6 army corps were transferred during the day to the southern bank, but beyond a cavalry reconnaissance, which was checked by Stuart, there was no fighting, and to every man in the Federal ranks it was perfectly plain that the delay was fatal. Lee, meanwhile, with ample time at his disposal and full confidence in the wisdom of his dispositions, calmly awaited the development of his adversary's plans. Jackson brought up A.P. Hill and Taliaferro at noon and posted them on Longstreet's right, but it was not till that hour, when it had at last become certain that the whole Federal army was crossing, that couriers were dispatched to call in Early and D.H. Hill. Once more the Army of Northern Virginia was concentrated at exactly the right moment on the field of battle. December 13. Like its predecessor, December 13th broke dull and calm, and the mist which shrouded river and plain hid from each other the rival hosts. Long before daybreak, the Federal divisions still beyond the stream began to cross, and as the morning wore on and the troops near Hazel Run moved forward from their bivouacs, the rumbling of artillery on the frozen roads, the loud words of command, and the sound of martial music came, muffled by the fog, to the ears of the Confederates lying expectant on the ridge. Now and again the curtain lifted for a moment, and the Southern guns assailed the long, dark columns of the foe. Very early had the Confederates taken up their position. The ravine of Deep Run, covered with tangled brushwood, was the line of demarcation between Jackson and Longstreet. On the extreme right of the Second Corps, and half a mile north of the marshy valley of the Massaponax, where a spur called Prospect Hill juts down from the wooded ridge, were 14 guns under Colonel Walker. Supported by 2 regiments of Field's brigade, these pieces were held back for the present within the forest which here clothed the ridge. Below Prospect Hill, and running thence along the front of the position, the embankment of the Richmond and Potomac Railroad formed a tempting breastwork. It was utilized, however, only by the skirmishers of the defence. The edge of the forest, 150 to 200 yards in rear, looked down upon an open and gentle slope, and along the brow of this natural glacis, covered by the thick timber, Jackson posted his fighting line. To this position it was easy to move up his supports and reserves without exposing them to the fire of artillery, and if the assailants should seize the embankment, he relied upon the deadly rifles of his infantry to bar their further advance up the ascent beyond. The light division supplied both the first and second lines of Jackson's army corps. To the left of Walker's guns, posted in a shelter trench within the skirts of the wood, was Archer's brigade of 7 regiments, including 2 of Field's, the left resting on a coppice that projected beyond the general line of forest. On the further side of this coppice, but nearer the embankment, lay Lane's brigade, an unoccupied space of 600 yards intervening between his right and Archer's left. Between Lane's right and the edge of the coppice was an open tract 200 yards in breadth. Both of these brigades had a strong skirmish line pushed forward along and beyond the railroad. 500 yards in rear, along a road through the woods which had been cut by Longstreet's troops, Gregg's South Carolina brigade, in second line, covered the interval between Archer and Lane. To Lane's left rear lay Pender's brigade, supporting 12 guns posted in the open on the far side of the embankment, and 21 massed in a field to the north of a small house named Bernard's Cabin. 400 yards in rear of Lane's left and Pender's right was stationed Thomas's brigade of 4 regiments. It is necessary to notice particularly the shape, size, and position of the projecting tongue of woodland, which broke the continuity of Hill's line. A German officer on Stuart's staff had the day previous, while riding along the position, remarked its existence and suggested the propriety of raising it. But although Jackson himself predicted that there would be the scene of the severest fighting, the ground was so marshy within its depths, and the undergrowth so dense and tangled, that it was judged impenetrable and left unoccupied, an error of judgment which cost many lives. General Lane had also recognized the danger of leaving so wide a gap between Archer and himself, and had so reported, but without effect, to his divisional commander. The coppice was triangular in shape, and extended nearly 600 yards beyond the embankment. The base, which faced the Federals, was 500 yards long. Beyond the apex the ground was swampy and covered with scrub, and the ridge, depressed at this point to a level with the plain, afforded no position from which artillery could command the approach to or issue from this patch of jungle. A space of 700 yards along the front was thus left undefended by direct fire. Early, who with D.H. Hill had marched in shortly after daybreak, formed the right of the third line, Taliaferro the left. The division of D.H. Hill, with several batteries, formed the general reserve, and a portion of Early's artillery was posted about half a mile in rear of his division, in readiness, if necessary, to relieve the guns on Prospect Hill. Jackson's line was 2,600 yards in length, and his infantry 30,000 strong, giving 11 rifles to the yard. But nearly three-fourths of the Army Corps, the divisions of Early, Taliaferro and D.H. Hill, were in third line and reserve. Of his 123 guns, only 47 were in position, but the wooded and broken character of the ground forbade a further deployment of his favourite arm. His left, near Deep Run, was in close touch with Hood's division of Longstreet's Army Corps, and in advance of his right, already protected by the Massaponax, was Stuart with 2 brigades and his horse artillery. One Whitworth gun, a piece of great range and large calibre, was posted on the wooded heights beyond the Massaponax, northeast of Yerby's house. Jackson's dispositions were almost identical with those which he had adopted at the Second Manassas. His whole force was hidden in the woods, every gun that could find room was ready for action, and the batteries were deployed in 2 masses. Instead, however, of giving each division a definite section of the line, he had handed over the whole front to A.P. Hill. This arrangement, however, had been made before D.H. Hill and Early came up, and with the battle imminent, a change was hazardous. In many respects, moreover, the ground he now occupied resembled that which he had so successfully defended on August 29th and 30. There was the wood opposite the centre, affording the enemy a covered line of approach, the open fields, pasture and stubble on either hand, the stream, hidden by timber and difficult of passage, on the one flank, and Longstreet on the other. But the position at Fredericksburg was less strong for defence than that at the Second Manassas, for not only was Jackson's line within 3,000 yards, a long range but not ineffective, of the heavy guns on the Stafford Heights, but on the bare plain between the railway and the river there was ample room for the deployment of the Federal field batteries. At the Second Manassas, on the other hand, the advantages of the artillery position had been on the side of the Confederates. Nevertheless, with the soldiers of Sharpsburg, ragged indeed and underfed, but eager for battle and strong in numbers, there was no reason to dread the powerful artillery of the foe, and Jackson's confidence was never higher than when, accompanied by his staff, he rode along his line of battle. He was not, however, received by his soldiers with their usual demonstrations of enthusiastic devotion. In honour of the day, he had put on the uniform with which Stuart had presented him. The old cadet cap, which had so often waved his men to victory, was replaced by a head-dress resplendent with gold lace. Little Sorrel had been deposed in favour of a more imposing charger, and the veterans failed to recognise their commander until he had galloped past them. A Confederate artilleryman has given a graphic picture of his appearance when the fight was at its hottest. A general officer, mounted upon a superb bay horse and followed by a single courier, rode up through our guns. Looking neither to the right nor the left, he rode straight to the front, halted, and seemed gazing intently on the enemy's line of battle. The outfit before me, from top to toe, cap, coat, top boots, horse and furniture, were all of the new order of things. But there was something about the man that did not look so new after all. He appeared to be an old-time friend of all the turmoil around him. As he had done us the honour to make an afternoon call on the artillery, I thought it becoming in someone to say something on the occasion. No one did, however, so, although a somewhat bashful and weak-kneed youngster, I plucked up courage enough to venture to remark that those big guns over the river had been knocking us about pretty considerably during the day. He quickly turned his head, and I knew in an instant who it was before me. The clear-cut, chiselled features, the thin, compressed and determined lips, the calm, steadfast eye, the countenance to command respect, and in time of war to give the soldier that confidence he so much craves from a superior officer, were all there. He turned his head quickly, and looking me all over, rode up the line and away as quickly and silently as he came, his little courier hard upon his heels. And this was my first sight of Stonewall Jackson,